child shivers on a cold stone bench in a windowless room, her small knees drawn up to a thin dress. Her fingers trace the mortar, as if mapping a way out of the fortress. Outside, beyond the barred shutter, the noise is purely political, the shouts the clash of armor, the sound of a kingdom tearing itself apart. But what truly reaches this small body is the gnawing ache of hunger and a steady, chilling sense of administrative cruelty. Measured rations, a list of names, a ledger of guilt. The child doesn't understand the word treason, only absence. Her father is gone. The servants are few. The grand household has been trimmed down like a frayed rope. Her toys, long gone. Letters arrive, but they are unreadable. Speaking of land, debts, and retribution, then she hears the phrase that will shatter and shape her life. An arranged destiny where her body and her name are mere units of exchange. This is punishment made precise and terrifyingly domestic. If you enjoy diving into these dark corners of history, please leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know how far these stories travel, and the price of pedigree. From that cramped, chilling certainty, the outline of Elizabeth de Badlesmere begins to take form. Born to Bartholomew de Badlesmere and Margaret de Clare, she entered the world not as a beloved daughter, but into the management of noble advantage. Her family held powerful offices and vast estates. Her life was immediately legible as political currency. The marriage contract that would follow refused the ambiguity of childhood, placing her within a dense, fragile web of alliances and rivalries that tears could never undo. Her first union was arranged when she was too small to walk unaided. The ceremony was recorded in a chapel roll, a chilling paper trace of a bargain sealed by clerical words. The immediate human cost went tragically unrecorded in any official return. The child who was married at 3, and who would later be imprisoned at 8. A quiet chronology of losses that the household would dismiss as collateral damage. Historians later unearthed these stark entries in chancery and church registers. The administrative handwriting maps the same cold, calculating logic the child must have felt in her bones. Her name is small in those records, but it persists, threaded through legal returns, papal letters, and inventories of plate and land. It was her first brutal lesson. Survival in this world depends less on kindness, and far more on pedigree, on whether her powerful kin could gather to protect her when the crown noticed her father's rebellion. The child bride, the contract that bound Elizabeth at age 3 to Sir Edmund Mortimer, was not a romantic union. It was a political transaction. It was enacted in a chapel at Harwood in Kinlet, Shropshire on June 27, 1316. The boy she married was likely between 10 and 15 years old. Both were children in body and mere instruments in the game of high politics. Contemporary practice permitted such unions as a means to cement alliances between magnates. The marriage, of course, would not be consummated until both reached maturity. Yet its legal reality mattered instantly. Entailments, wardships, and rights of custody immediately followed the signing of that parchment and the exchange of vows. Roger Mortimer, Edmund's father, was a powerful rising force, a tie to the Mortimer family. Interests offered both protection and promise to Bartholomew de Badlesmere's line. The document for the union itself survives only in references, mentions, and memorials, and later genealogical compilations. It shows us how noble families use their children as stock in a market of influence. For Elizabeth, this meant a life measured in the cold calculus of advantage. Her personal authority was non-existent. The household that raised her remained under her mother's stern direction until a fateful set of events unstitched their security. Yet these early days also consolidated claims that would prove remarkably durable. When fortunes shifted and names were stripped from placards, that child marriage would be cited for rights and succession. Even child brides could become the linchpins in inheritance disputes decades later. The Mortimer alliance would propel Elizabeth into a different orbit, exposing her to the better rooms of power and the even greater stakes of noble rivalry, where a single rebellion could utterly unmake a family and consign their children to cold, dark cells. The siege and the tower. Elizabeth's childhood, even before the siege that would alter her family permanently, was routinely interrupted by the mechanics of lordship. Rents collected, nights arranged and feasts scheduled to announce alliances. Bartholomew de Badlesmere served as steward in the royal household, an office that put him uncomfortably close to the very machinery of kingship. Margaret de Clare, his wife, was herself of a powerful line, a niece to an earl, and accustomed to the expectation that noble women administer estates and enforce household discipline. Their daughter's early education would have been practical, reading for prayer, estate accounts, and the management of a retinue. Yet the household's ultimate political choice, participation in baronial resistance, altered that training into something far harsher, the refusal at Leeds. Castle to admit a queen's retinue was not a minor social slight. It was an intentional assertion of authority by Margaret that signaled a willingness to contest royal privilege. Chroniclers record the event bluntly: a refusal, an attack on the queen's men, and an immediate escalation. Such local acts of defiance were recorded not for their cruelty, but for their consequences. The records that survive are punitive ledgers and rolls of siege. For Elizabeth, who still navigated the small world of chambers and chapels, that refusal marked the household as terminally vulnerable. The politics of her parents would become the legal grounds for her own imprisonment and her family's dispossession. The siege that followed the refusal did not read like a pageant. Contemporary chronicles emphasize its speed and brutality. Forces loyal to the crown moved against Leeds Castle, and Bartholomew de Badlesmere's alignment with rebellious peers placed the entire family under the gravest suspicion. Legal writs, orders to seize property, and punitive fines followed swiftly. Bartholomew joined a coalition that opposed certain royal favorites and policies. In the political atmosphere of the time, such alliances were often fatal. When the balance of power shifted, the family seat faced confiscation. Margaret de Clare and her children, including an 8-year-old Elizabeth, were taken into custody. Contemporary administrative records coldly record their transfer to the royal custody that the kings of England used for noble prisoners. The imprisonment of noble women and children was hardly rare, but it was precise, a means to display the crown's terrifying reach and to deny the rebel household any leverage. For Elizabeth, the incarceration was formative. The records show not only an entry in a ledger, but also later petitions and accounts that reference the costs of maintaining noble prisoners. Those dry administrative notes are the sole basis for reconstructing hours of fear and the slow arithmetic of deprivation during her confinement. The ledger of loss. The legal process that led to Bartholomew de Badlesmere's execution unfolded in the ordinary language of treason trials, indictments, attainders, estates forfeit to the crown. The parliamentary rolls and chancery petitions document a sequence of judgments that culminated in the stripping away of title and property. In this procedure, the personal is translated into paperwork, lists of manors, valuations, the names of heirs excluded by attainder. Execution for treason was the state's ultimate instrument. It removed a head from its social body and violently redistributed its assets. For Elizabeth, the consequence was immediate and material. Lands that had supported her upbringing were seized. Wardship shifted. Her marriage connection suddenly became essential, not for affection, but for the restoration of any claim. Execution for treason was the state's ultimate instrument. It removed a head from its social body and violently redistributed its assets. For Elizabeth, the consequence was immediate and material. Lands that had supported her upbringing were seized. Wardship shifted. Her marriage connection suddenly became essential, not for affection, but for the restoration of any claim. Contemporary chroniclers note the cruelty of executing a baron, but their records are also deeply concerned with the redistribution that followed. Who receives which manor, which household? The child's losses were meticulously catalogued alongside the land being transferred. Her mother's status degraded into a custody problem for the crown. Margaret de Clare's person was detained, and her children became, in the records, property to be administered. The Tower of London looms in the administrative record as a repository for high-profile prisoners. The evidence for Elizabeth's confinement there comes from custodian rolls and household returns that list noble wards and their costs. The tower was less a dramatic, dark dungeon in the popular imagination, and more a managed residence for those whose detention required official notice. For a child of 8, however, the reality was still abrasive. Movement was restricted. Company was limited to household retainers approved by royal officers. And her childhood was brutally interrupted by visitation lists and the interrogations of adult kin. The tower's records include payments for food, for bedding, and occasionally for the child's schooling or medical care. These entries permit historians to reconstruct an ordinary chronology of confinement. Seasons passing, household members reassigned, and the political negotiations continuing outside those cold walls. The imprisonment was both punishment and leveraged negotiation, currency in the crown's hands. For Elizabeth, later historians have argued the experience left an indelible mark. It informed her understanding of power, of the terrifying fragility of noble privilege, and of the necessity, often enforced by marriage, of aligning with families whose fortunes might protect hers in turn. The rise and fall. Release from custody did not automatically restore a formerly noble household. After Roger Mortimer's intervention and his dramatic rise to power, Elizabeth's circumstances shifted dramatically. Mortimer's ascendancy altered the legal architecture that had condemned her family. Pardons, reversals of attainder, and restoration of estates followed. Documents from the period note, petitions and grant rolls that returned property to formerly dispossessed families when the political winds changed. For Elizabeth, this meant movement from constrained custody to a secure place within one of the most powerful households in the realm. While in confinement, she had been a dependent on the crown. After Mortimer's stunning success, she became a beneficiary of his triumph. The same documents that record a baronial execution also record the later grants that restored lands and titles. Those legal reversals are cold in the language of chancery, but they describe a fundamental change in daily reality. Larger rooms, more servants, and the rituals of court life replacing the austerity of a prison diet. That shift was not mere comfort. It was reintegration into the networks that determined marriage markets, inheritance, and political standing. Yet Mortimer's power rested on precarious foundations that would later expose Elizabeth to further instability. Living in Mortimer's household gave Elizabeth visibility and protection for a time. Roger Mortimer, the first Earl of March, exercised near absolute power at the center of government, after the overthrow of Edward II, becoming the de facto ruler. Chronicles from the period detail Mortimer's vast influence and the circulation of his clients and kin into positions of profit. For Elizabeth, the association brought privileges, household retinues, marriage prospects for her children, and political connections that could not be purchased. It also placed her within a family whose prominence would inevitably make it a target when factions reformed. The Mortimers' hold on power attracted enemies at court, and their rise reinvented the family as both patron and potential prisoner. The documents that describe the distribution of office and patronage are explicit. Grants of land, stewardship appointments, and marriage arrangements. This proximity to authority shows how quickly restoration could turn into exposure. Elizabeth's life illustrates that noble rehabilitation after a fall remained dangerously conditional on the fortunes of those above them. The fall of Roger Mortimer in 1330 was swift and decisive. Taken in a coup orchestrated by the young King Edward III, Mortimer was arrested, tried, and executed. Official records of the arrest, parliamentary verdicts, and the execution itself survive. In royal rolls and in contemporary chroniclers, who describe the spectacle, Mortimer's fall had immediate repercussions for his entire household. Edmund Mortimer, Elizabeth's husband, found his prospects narrowed as the political capital that had protected him simply vanished. The legal consequences extended beyond the executed earl to his sons and clients. Property claims reversed once again, patronage was withdrawn, and all those tied to Mortimer were exposed to reprisal. For Elizabeth, this reversal meant the reactivation of vulnerabilities she thought had been neutralized. The life made possible by Mortimer's rule could be taken away by the Crown's determination to reassert authority. Records of confiscation demonstrate a pattern. When a magnate fell, the Crown reclaimed lands and redistributed them to loyal followers, and the women and children of the fallen were often left to negotiate the fragments. Widowhood and realliance. Edmund Mortimer's death shortly after his father's execution further unsettled Elizabeth's position. Whether he died of illness or other causes in late 1331 or early 1332, the result was the same. Elizabeth became a widow with two young sons, Roger and John. The Inquisition post-mortem and other legal records later identify her children and their claims. The elder son, Roger, would eventually inherit the title as the second Earl of March. But as a minor, his household and lands required guardianship and management. Widows in Elizabeth's position faced immediate legal questions. Who would hold wardship? Who would manage the estates? And which marriages would secure the children's futures? Her legal status as widow and mother placed her in a position of intense negotiation with other noble houses. This was the paradox of noble life. Tragedy could convert into agency when properly navigated, but it also left a widow exposed to the designs of men who could profit from her children's minority. Surviving accounts show petitions and settlements. They map the practical, grinding work required to keep a medieval lineage intact after successive shocks. Elizabeth's second marriage to William de Bohun in 1335 was a strategic calculation that required a papal dispensation because of kinship ties between the Mortimer and Bohun lines. The dispensation itself survives in ecclesiastical registers, a bureaucratic imprint of a private, life-altering decision. William de Bohun was an experienced military commander and a man of significant standing. The union healed a previous enmity between families and provided much-needed protection to Elizabeth and her sons. Marriage to Bohun elevated Elizabeth to the rank of countess, bringing with it both security and new responsibilities. The marriage negotiated the immediate problem of guardianship and offered a patron whose closeness to royal service could shield her children's inheritances. For Bohun, the match consolidated his position among the leading magnates of the realm. Records of land transactions and household accounts after 1335 show the integration of Elizabeth's interest into Bohun estates and the careful reallocation of income to provide for heirs of both lines. The union of Elizabeth and William de Bohun also altered genealogical trajectories in ways historians recognize as consequential. Their son Humphrey, born in 1342, would eventually inherit multiple titles and marry into the web that led to royal contention. Even more critically, their daughter Mary's marriage several generations later produced Mary de Bohun, who married Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV. This link is one of the roots by which Elizabeth's blood entered the line of kings. Court records, marriage contracts, and later pedigree charts trace these connections with a business-like clarity. For Elizabeth, the marriage to Bohun was both a personal transition from widowhood back into political life and a strategic measure with long-term consequences. Property settlements show how dowries and jointures were arranged to secure the future of children from both her first and second marriages. The administrative traces left behind, writs, royal confirmations, and ecclesiastical permissions form the factual backbone for understanding how a woman married at 3 could ultimately anchor a genealogical line to the throne. Elizabeth's role as mother and household manager under William de Bohun is visible in account roles and in property transactions that required a woman's signature or consent. Noble women frequently oversaw estates, managed servants, arranged marriages for younger kin, and directed the spiritual patronage of churches. Elizabeth's elevated position required such governance. Surviving records show grants to religious houses and endowments that indicate she took an active part in shaping the family's public presence. Her will made on May 31, 1356, reflects that managerial role. It itemizes bequests and requests for burial, showing both piety and a clear awareness of the symbolic uses of burial spaces. The will's language is pragmatic: directions for masses, distributions of goods, and care for dependents. It was the legal culmination of a woman's earthly jurisdiction, recorded in notarial hands and sealed as a public document. The children of Elizabeth's second marriage further anchored her in the political fabric. Humphrey de Bohun, their son, inherited substantial titles and lands and became a key magnate in the following generation. His marriage alliances and progeny extended Elizabeth's influence by blood. Their daughter, Elizabeth de Bohun, married Richard FitzAlan, 11th Earl of Arundel, further reinforcing the family's reach. Pedigree rolls and heraldic visitations record these unions in bureaucratic detail. These documents are neither flattering nor intimate. They function as legal proof of descent and entitlement. For Elizabeth de Badlesmere, being the nexus of these relationships meant her early victimization had transformed into a generative position. Through her offspring, she established durable bonds. Yet, the administrative records also remind us that these bonds were not solely emotional. They were instruments of policy. Marriage was a political technology. The status of co-heiress after her brother, Giles de Badlesmere's death in 1338, reinforced Elizabeth's economic footing. Giles's death without heirs distributed the Badlesmere claims among the surviving sisters. Inquisitions post-mortem and fine rolls document the partition and the subsequent confirmations of rights. Being a co-heiress increased Elizabeth's legal capital, expanding her claim to manors and rents that bolstered the Bohun estate and her own household. These technical procedures, valuations, disputes over boundaries, and the final issuance of writs confirming ownership are the granular facts historians piece together to reconstruct the skeleton of noble power. Her co-heirship also had political consequences. Property translated into men and influence, and every manor added to a lord's retinue and resources for war or patronage. The legal apparatus that sorted inheritance was indifferent to childhood trauma. It counted acres and obligations, not emotions. For Elizabeth, the settlement meant a measure of financial resilience that would influence her family's standing for decades. In the later years of her life, Elizabeth acted within the available channels of influence: patronage of religious houses, settlement negotiations, and the management of dowries for younger relations. Her request to be buried at the Church of the Black Friars in London, recorded in her will and in subsequent monastic registers, reflects both spiritual concerns and social positioning. Burial in a prominent religious house was an assertion of status and a tool for memory. Elizabeth died at Warewell, Essex, on June 8, 1356. The timing, laid down in chronicles and in her will's dating, closed a life that began as a political instrument and ended as a matriarch of dynastic lines. Legal materials that mention Elizabeth, writs, grants, and papal dispensations are the scaffolding historians use to reconstruct a life otherwise invisible in narrative history. Primary sources show the make and break of noble fortunes, the roll that records the marriage at Harwood, the Tower's custodial accounts, Mortimer's grant rolls, and Bohun's household books. These texts are not neutral. They were written by administrators invested in property and authority, yet together they allow a clear narrative. A girl married as part of an alliance, imprisoned with her family, restored and elevated, then married again into a house that repaired and advanced her fortunes. Every act of the state left an imprint. The later prominence of Elizabeth's descendants is not a matter of retrospective romanticism, but of legal and political fact. The genealogical connections she established through her marriages placed her descendants in positions that mattered to claims of succession. The Mortimer claim, transmitted through her first marriage, later furnished a basis for contention in the 14th and 15th centuries. Similarly, the Bohun inheritance fed into marriages that linked to Lancastrian interests. The bureaucratic record documents how these inheritances were assembled and contested. The consequences were not merely noble pride. They structured the alignments that produced civil conflict. The arithmetic of inheritance converts private sorrow into national consequence. The social mechanisms that enable such transmission are bureaucratic and relentless. Wardship records show guardians collecting rents for minors. Marriage licenses show alliances being brokered to settle debts and secure loyalties. And Inquisition's post-mortem distributed property according to clear, cold rules. Elizabeth's life appears in these procedural documents precisely because she participated in them as a party, a petitioner, and a respondent. Her petitions for property, the papal application for her second marriage, and the notation of her burial wishes are all administrative acts that leave traces. The final accounting of Elizabeth de Battlesmere's life is a matter of documents and descendants. She was married at 3 at Harwood, became a mother in adolescence, was imprisoned with her family in the Tower, saw her father executed for treason, was restored, and ultimately, through her second marriage, became a progenitor of the line that led to Henry IV. Her story is not an isolated tragedy, but a structural illustration of how the medieval aristocracy reproduced itself through legal mechanisms that could elevate or annihilate households. The record is merciless in its clarity. Marriages contracted while children were infants. Wardships sold and executed. Attainders issued and later reversed. Wills composed to secure memory. That cold machinery produced a woman who was at once a victim and a shrewd agent. Her tomb at the Blackfriars marked the final reconciliation of a life bound to institutions that could deny and then restore favor. The reflection this history leaves is stark. Political life in her age was administered in chancery, and the human cost, detention, early motherhood, the execution of kin, remains a factual ledger that the archive preserves, instead of the consolation of a narrative. Such is the truth of Elizabeth de Battlesmere, a life constrained by the necessities of lineage, translated into documents that outlived her, and made consequential by the descendants her enforced marriages produced.